Hello and welcome to our second CAHRS webcast of 2023. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conity Professor of Strategic Human Resources here in the ILR School at Cornell. I also serve as the Academic Director of our Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies, and it's great to have all of you joining us here today to talk about optimizing hybrid work. Hybrid work has certainly become the default work model for many companies. Although companies are at different stages of their journey, for many, the basic infrastructure has been established and attention is really now shifted to how can we further evolve and optimize these new work models. At the same time, the world around us continues to be highly volatile and uncertain. In a growing number of sectors, concerns about labor shortages and resignations have given ways to fear of a slowing economy and implications that it may have, particularly in terms of layoffs and hiring freezes. These shifts in the demand for talent have recently led many companies to reevaluate the configuration and impact of hybrid work models within their organizations. The ever-shifting sentiment surrounding hybrid work can be seen in some of the headlines appearing in various media outlets. Last summer and into the fall, the narrative surrounding hybrid work was largely positive, as reflected by a snapshot of these headlines that you see here. Sure, there were detractors, but overall, most companies seem to be embracing hybrid work, either by choice or out of necessity. And it was seen as really a win-win for both employees and employers. More recently, however, we've started to see more headlines like this one, which appeared in the Wall Street Journal in late March, suggesting that some leaders and companies may be souring on remote and hybrid work models. This particular article I found interesting because it highlighted a number of issues or challenges. One was the idea that as the economy slows, this has perhaps created an opportunity for leaders who were never really on board with hybrid or flexible work to push for a return to the office. There were also concerns in this article around, how sustainable is remote work? In particular, the initial success that we saw around remote work in the early stages of the pandemic, are those same successes sustainable over the long term? For example, as highlighted by the quote that you see on your screen, there's this idea that unlike during the pandemic, employees working from home today face many more potential distractions. Although I think some of this reflects somewhat outdated thinking, but I think it does highlight that certainly there are a lot more things that can cause distractions in today's environment as opposed to the early days when we were in shutdown mode. Also, there's the argument that remote work or hybrid work may have worked really well when individuals were working with colleagues whom they already knew from working with them for years in the office. But perhaps it's proving much harder to onboard new managers and employees in this remote environment and getting them up to speed. Lastly, there were some quotes from various companies that have kind of looked at the performance effects and have found purportedly that they have found at-home performance falling lower than the performance that employees achieve when they're actually in the office in person. The final point in this article that was interesting was really around the importance of perhaps bringing people together in the current state of affairs where companies are trying to drive efficiency, trying to drive the current slowdown, weather the current slowdown. This idea that, do we really need to bring people back together to foster greater levels of trust and human connection in this environment? And certainly in the past, we can see examples of companies like Yahoo and others that scrapped their remote work programs when the going got tough. And this article suggests that some of that sentiment is arising currently as well. So given this kind of shifting and divergent set of views, we felt that it was really an opportune time to bring together our CAHRS partners to share what they've been seeing within their own companies. Thus, we conducted a working group recently in which we explored a number of issues. First, we really wanted to dig into, what is the current state of hybrid work across companies? And in particular, how has it continued to evolve since it was first introduced during the early stages or following the pandemic. Second, really trying to dig into, now that it's been in place for a little while, what are companies seeing in terms of the impact that it's having on different employee groups and outcomes? Is there evidence, for example, to support or refute, some of these claims that we maybe see arising in the popular press? And finally, what are some of the unresolved issues and pain points related to hybrid work that companies are continuing to work through? And what are some of the strategies that they're perhaps adopting to deal with those? So in the time remaining today, what I plan to do is to share some of our key findings that emerged from this work and to highlight, what that may mean for our efforts to continually optimize these hybrid work models. Before I dig into our findings, I would just like to highlight, would really love to see, have you participate in today's discussion. You can do that in two ways. One is you can submit your questions to me as I go through the webcast today using the Q&A function here in Zoom. I'll be kind of monitoring the Q&A and perhaps we'll take some of those as they come in, or we'll certainly leave time at the end to address some of your questions. I would also encourage you to interact with other attendees today through the chat function by sharing your own experiences. How are the findings that I'm sharing maybe aligning or not with what you're seeing in your own organization, as well as other ideas that you have to offer. So moving on into kind of, what we found in this working group. Again, we started with this discussion around, what's the current state? How does, how does hybrid work continue to evolve across different companies? And one area that it became clear early on that has evolved considerably is around, for lack of a better term, the decision-making process surrounding these hybrid work models. When companies first adopted these models, many had a standard model that they put into place across the organization, such as 2 days in office, 3 days remote, and this was really designed to be the company-wide standard. Naturally, there was some variation, there were some deviations from this stated model, but those deviations really tended to be more the exception than the norm. Increasingly, however, what we're seeing is that companies seem to be adopting more differentiated models based on things like geography or location, work unit, team, employee roles and responsibilities, and other factors. For example, one of the attendees in the working group highlighted or shared that they recently increased the number of on-site days required in some of their Asia Pacific locations, really due to a demand from employees to have more in-person interaction. And these types of adjustments suggest that there might not be a one-size-fits-all model, and that we really need to be thinking about how do we adjust to these cross-cultural differences or other differences that might exist across locations or employee bases. Relatedly, a number of the working group participants mentioned that their companies had recently increased the minimum number of on-site days across the company, usually moving from a model of 2 days on-site to 3 days on-site. Other companies certainly, said that they were kind of holding their models relatively constant in terms of days on site. But what I thought was interesting is that we didn't hear any cases of companies moving more in the direction of remote work. If there were adjustments being made, it was almost always in the other direction of really increasing the amount of time the employees were spending in person on site. Finally, and somewhat relatedly, what we heard is that companies seem to be adopting more fixed schedules for on-site days. For example, all employees may be expected to be on site certain days of the week, like Tuesday and Wednesday. And this trend really seems to be in response to the fact that when scheduling was more at the discretion of employees, there would often be days when people would be coming into the office really without any other members of their team on site. Naturally, this led to employees asking, why am I here? What's the value of being on site if no other person I'm working with is really here? And it really served to undermine some of the benefits of the kind of on-site models in terms of enhanced communication and collaboration. So by adopting these more fixed schedules, companies are really hoping to create these days when you have this critical mass of people on site, that's enhancing the value proposition of returning to the office. Interesting, we've heard also some companies adopting almost a hybrid type approach to even this scheduling issue where, employees might be expected to be on site 3 days a week. Maybe 2 of those days are fixed, Tuesday and Wednesday, let's say, and then employees have the flexibility to choose what day of the week they want to come in for their third day. So there is some, variation that companies are working through even around this scheduling issue. Also, when in discussing the current state, we spent some time talking about issues surrounding implementation. And what we heard is that certainly over the past year, with all of the challenges surrounding labor shortages and the Great Resignation, other issues, companies were largely treading lightly in terms of really holding employees accountable for returning to the office. They were encouraging it, but it was really largely at the discretion of employees. However, perhaps because of the slowing economy and reduced demand for talent, we're seeing more companies really trying to send the message that return to the office is expected, not just encouraged, and that failure to comply may have consequences. Although it's important to note, and I'll come back to in a bit, those consequences aren't always clear. Just one example of this is we heard from a number of attendees at the working group that in cases where employees moved away during the pandemic, they're being told they need to return to the local area so they're available and able to come into the office. And if they're unwilling or unable to do so, that may lead to their termination. So I think this is, an example of how companies are really trying to drive greater compliance with these return to office mandates. But at the same time, we continue to really see companies offer a variety of incentives aimed at trying to enhance the value proposition around return to the office. These include things such as in-person networking and social events on site. So overall, it seems like companies are really trying to leverage both the carrot and the stick to facilitate this return to the office. Given these trends, it's not surprising that there's also an increased focus on tracking compliance and impact associated with hybrid work. For example, we heard a number of cases in the working group about companies looking at employee badge swipes or creating these return to office trackers and dashboards. So there's kind of clear data visible on the extent to which employees are coming in. But we also heard that these solutions aren't perfect. It often can be much more complex to really dig in that data and make sense of that data than it may seem on the surface. Employees, for example, may not be on site because they're meeting with clients, or again, maybe they're part of a remote team where all other members of their team are remote. So, it can be difficult to make sense of that data, as well as, we heard examples of where employees have found ways around some of those systems. For example, they come to the office, they swipe in for the day, and then they leave and go home. So I think this step in the right direction, but there's still some work that needs to be done on how to track some of these outcomes. One of the most interesting things that I thought I heard during the meeting was really around how organizations are trying to facilitate best practice sharing internally within their own HR business partner population. For example, one company mentioned that they've created a working group where these HR business partners from different units come together on a regular basis to share notes on what are they seeing around hybrid work within their unit, what are some practices they found to be successful or unsuccessful, maybe where are some adjustments or changes needed. And that can be really useful for kind of helping to evolve and optimize these practices within our own organizations. After talking about the current state, we spent some time in the working group comparing notes on what are companies seeing with regard to the impact of hybrid work on various employee outcomes. And the three that we really spent time talking about was employee attraction, retention, and productivity. In terms of attraction, many of the working group participants noted that they have really moved to this model where now they'll initially advertise positions as hybrid or on-site. If they can't find a suitable candidate, then they may consider moving the position to a remote position if that is indeed appropriate. But in many cases, it seems like companies are adopting hybrid or on-site is really the norm when posting, and only revert to these fully remote options kind of as a last resort. Although some companies noted that they had lost, some employees in 2022 due to the push to return to the office, it seems like that relationship between, return to the office or hybrid work and attrition or retention has really kind of weakened in recent months. And we talked about, what may be some of the reasons for that. Again, we came back to ideas surrounding the slowing economy, and the implications for the demand for talent, and as well as job security from the employee side. Second, this idea that we're seeing greater convergence among companies in the same industry adopting similar hybrid work policies and practices. So maybe it's not as much of a differentiator anymore as employees are looking to move organizations. And finally, a growing realization among at least some employees that they may actually prefer hybrid work over these fully remote models. Working at home full time may have seemed ideal in the abstract, but now that they've experienced it for a while, they may be missing that in-person interaction and are actually looking to move more into those hybrid models. Despite all the claims that I showed earlier around, productivity and how it's being maybe negatively impacted by hybrid work, among the participants in the working group, it was pretty clear that really we haven't been able to nail down or get a strong handle on that relationship between hybrid work and productivity. And I think in part this is due to some of the challenges I highlighted earlier around just tracking employees and knowing where and when different employees are working, but also certainly due to the other point earlier around the increased kind of diversity of hybrid work models within organizations. Given that diversity, it's kind of hard to make blanket statements around hybrid work and the relationship to productivity, because hybrid work isn't this kind of unitary idea. But clearly, this is kind of the holy grail, so to speak, of measurement around hybrid work in terms of really trying to understand this relationship. And so strong desire among companies that we've been talking to in terms of really trying to nail that down. And so that seems to be on the agenda going forward. So just, I thought I would kind of close here before taking a few questions. Again, if you have any questions or thoughts, would love to have you submit them via the Q&A. But we did hear some, unresolved and ongoing issues that companies continue to wrestle with in this space. One that came up was really around this issue of, what to do when employees request additional flexibility. And these cases can be challenging because there's really this desire on the part of organizations to strike an appropriate balance between wanting to support employees, but also really making sure that we can meet our business goals and objectives. There's cases where accommodations are being requested for medical reasons, and that process tends to be, relatively straightforward. But other personal requests, however, can be much trickier because there is not always set policies and procedures for dealing with those. Often these really come down to the judgment of the manager, often in conjunction with the HR business partner, to really decide how to handle such requests. And I think this is where the idea that I shared earlier around having these internal working groups that are sharing what they're seeing and how they're approaching and dealing with different issues internally can really be helpful for creating some consistency around these more idiosyncratic cases that may emerge from time to time. We also heard challenges, particularly in teams that are highly remote or virtual, around really creating this sense of connectedness among employees. As I highlighted earlier, we heard many examples of where employees might go into an office regularly, but really largely work alone because many members or all members of their team are elsewhere. And so, yes, they're coming in the office, but they're sitting in their office or cubicle, on Zoom meetings, virtual meetings all day, which is certainly not the ideal or the intent. So we heard, examples of how organizations are trying to promote that connectedness, certainly through things like, virtual team building sessions can help, but we also heard a lot about the challenges in organizing those when members span different locations and time zones. The most effective solution seems to be, let's get everybody together in person, a few times a year, but that's obviously costly and not always feasible. A final challenge that we heard in this most recent working group, and really one that we've heard, I'd say repeatedly over the last few years, is around this idea of, what should we be doing around those employees that are on site and need to be on site because maybe their job is really not amenable to location flexibility. And we heard examples of companies looking at, is there other forms of flexibility that we can implement for those employees, such as schedule flexibility or shift swapping, for example. We also heard examples of where companies are really encouraging, or in some cases requiring, leadership to be on site fully themselves, really just kind of set the tone and the example. However, these efforts do not seem to have entirely resolved the feelings of inequity that we often hear expressed by this employee group. So I think managing these employees in particular will continue to be an area of focus across many organizations. So with that, I'd love to take your questions. I've seen a few come in as we've been going through. If you have others, I would certainly welcome you to submit them. So one of the first questions is around kind of this idea of mentioned that RTO is now expected and that companies are attaching consequences to noncompliance. What are some examples of that? I would say, although almost every company in the working group, really indicate that return to office is now kind of mandated in their organization, it's an expectation, really mixed approaches in terms of what we heard across companies in terms of, the attaching of consequences to these policies. Some readily admitted that, they really don't have a good way of tracking employees and the extent to which they're on site versus working remotely, which obviously makes it difficult to really, attach consequences to noncompliance. But we did also hear some emerging examples of other companies that are using attendance as a performance measure and really letting employees know that it is something that can now come into the equation as we think about things like pay and bonuses. I suspect that until we see maybe an uptick in the demand for talent, that we'll see companies probably experimenting more with some of these more punitive measures tied to non-compliance as they really try to drive this return to the office. Let's see, another question that came in, this idea around connectedness that was mentioned, really asking around, how effective are these virtual team building sessions? Yeah, I think that's a good question. What we've heard, I think, is, in lieu of bringing people together in person, they can be helpful for just kind of creating a space for bonding and interaction among team members to create that connection that may otherwise be harder to create in our day-to-day. But interestingly, there's actually been some research emerging that suggests that building in these social rituals, as they're called, into our regular rhythm as teams might actually be more effective than the occasional kind of formal team building event. So what's an example of a social ritual? A good example is, at every one of our virtual meetings, we're going to take 5 or 10 minutes just to allow for open discussion around anything that our team might want to talk about. We might want to talk about organizational politics. People might want to share personal updates on themselves. We might want to express gratitude for different members of our team. But this idea of just creating a space for the team to engage in non-task-based communication, so we really get to understand people more as individuals and humans as opposed to just coworkers. There's some evidence that those can really actually be quite effective for creating this sense of connectedness and culture in our teams. A couple more questions. One that came up was around, how are companies helping to prepare managers and leaders to manage in this new kind of hybrid environment? And I think this isn't something that we spent a lot of time talking about in this particular working group, but it's certainly something that we've heard in our other research that companies are focusing on. I think there's a sense that to some degree, some manager development kind of slipped during the pandemic. And I think it's a lot of organizations are now trying to catch up and really help to equip those managers, particularly new managers in general, but in particular, how to kind of manage in this new hybrid environment. For example, we heard one organization that has rolled out some training to its managers around how to evaluate performance based more on outcomes than simply attendance, as well as some strategies on how to avoid things like proximity and other types of biases that may be more prevalent in the hybrid environment. So I think these are examples of where companies are trying to go and to really equip managers with the capabilities they need in this new environment. And then one final question is around, what are companies doing in terms of pay for those employees that may be relocated during the pandemic and are allowed to kind of stay relocated and work remotely? Are they adjusting pay? This was something that came up in our working group. And what we heard is that in many cases, companies aren't adjusting pay, but what they are doing is telling those employees that if they've moved to a lower cost of living area, their salary might actually be frozen for a few years until the kind of local market catches up to where they're at. So there's this idea of, we're not necessarily going to penalize you, but we are going to, maybe freeze things for a while until it kind of calibrates. So thanks everybody for your questions. Thank you for attending today's session. We will be sharing out a copy of the slides as well as a recording of today's presentation. So I certainly encourage you to share it with others within your organization that may be interested. And I hope to see you at another one of our upcoming CAHRS events. Take care.